Welcome back to Eliminating the Pitfalls, Steps to Virtualization in Government, sponsored by Nutanix on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. My guests are Dave Gwynn from Nutanix, Chuck Riddle from the Government Printing Office, Gary Bartlett from the Postal Service Inspector General's Office, and Greg Garcia from the Army. Gentlemen, I want to talk about execution and deployment and sustenance in this part of our conversation. Gary, you talked about the idea of putting this out and explaining it to your end users, your customers, in such a way that they're going to be coming to you and saying, when's this going to happen? All right, so you push the button, but it doesn't look that way to the end user. You're ready to go, but as we talked about during the break, the end user doesn't see it one way when they leave one afternoon and see it a different way when they come in the next morning. So how do you meet those expectations for what the end users have while at the same time achieving the results that you laid out in your business plan and your development?
So I think, first of all, it starts with as you're working through your test groups and listening to their feedback and understanding, what worked for them, what didn't work for them, as far as when you decide to flip that switch and when you decide to start making that transition. And then really building that expectation a little bit to what Greg touched on earlier is building those expectations of this is how the transition is going to occur. This is how long it's going to take. And that's key, is making sure that they understand when it's going to occur and how long it's going to take. And by the way, there's going to be some hiccups, right? Mm-hmm. There's going to be some problems, and making sure that they understand you're bound to have a problem. It's not going to be perfect. And when you have a problem, here's who you call, and here's how we're going to resolve those problems for you. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really the best way, is to really look at it holistically and really understand and put yourself in the customer's shoes and try to answer those questions for them before they occur.
Yeah. Chuck, those are exactly the reasons, though, that people are resistant to change. They don't want to go through these uncomfortable experiences of, I got to call somebody, or this looks different, or I have to figure something out. Mm-hmm. And so helping them to anticipate what's going to happen is important. Also, though, tell me about, given some of the environments that you're working in and some of the end users that you have that aren't typical, meeting those expectations while also achieving the results that you want to achieve.
Sure. It's interesting. I find that a lot of our customers have technology at home that far exceeds their technology at work. So these same people that may not have an assigned machine from work, they might have a huge network at home, and they're very savvy with technology. So their expectations are already very high. So what we try to do is under-promise and then over-deliver, and always leave them wanting more and surprise with new features, rather than definitely. Sometimes I think it's better not to say we're going to have something by a certain date, because you almost have to anticipate setbacks. Mm-hmm. And instead of saying it's going to happen by this date, give them a time range and then just pleasantly surprise them to say, we're ahead of schedule, here's what you're going to get. Mm-hmm. And, oh, by the way, these are features like what you have at home. Running applications in the cloud, by the way, we're going to be able to do that for you as well. So I think it's almost like a lot of things in life. You want to under-promise, over-deliver, and then expect the unexpected, I guess.
The maintenance behind the scenes, Greg, tell me about continuing that and making sure that you get a great rollout, everything, you're seeing the results that you want to see, your end users are giving you positive feedback. That's not the end of the process, is it?
Absolutely not. I just one note before is that I think just one expectation I like to clear up is that not every desktop is the same. What we found is for our implementation was that there were some sort of super graphical users that required different capability than the rest of the population. So the question is, what do you scale that virtual desktop to be? Is it super for everybody, which brings in cost, or do you find and define that segment that requires that extra computing capability and then go forward? So we really have these kind of a regular user and these super graphical users that have different capacities and capabilities. And that has some nuance in how you build that sustainable. What we basically did was a little pod infrastructure. So we have the sort of a self-contained pod that will give this block of users, this graphical super user and regular users, and then just scale that pod, replicate that pod to the population base. Mm-hmm. That allows us to sustain a small enterprise and a big enterprise, and also to isolate any kind of COOP capability that will have to be addressed. That's one thing we learned in the pilot, is the resiliency of the solution. When you go to virtual, I call it X over, X as a service, everything is a service. When everybody depends on that network connection from desktop to application and to video to voice, presence, email, If that network has any kind of blip, you're affecting their entire day and their ability to do any work. So that resiliency has to be built in, and that's really where the proof in the pudding is in understanding the requirement, providing a good experience, but having absolutely a backup plan of how to provide them continuous experience through numerous things that will happen. Things always happen. A lot of our dependence is on commercial vendors for circuits, or we've had an earthquake here, we've had a hurricane here, we've had every kind of natural disaster you could have here happens. The National Capital Region is not excluded from this. So you have to build resiliency into that solution because it is demanded to be there 24/7 for that ability to accomplish the mission. So what basically you have to do is some of this is building internal skills. So we're facing a lot of restrictions on. So you have to have the balance between contracting out the knowledge and then having internal people that can sustain that. There's a balance of having people that are government workers that have the knowledge to make that infrastructure operate with a segment of surge population for that you contract out. But it can't be wholly dependent on a single contractor because then, as you know, contracts turn over, you're going to incur a risk downstream. So you have to build some requisite knowledge inside your internal workforce and have that supplemented as you go through the process.
Dave?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit analogous to you picture a huge cruise ship that has happy vacationers on their cruise, and then you have an engine room down below where there's a lot going on, and this is the phase where how you designed your engine room is as relevant as how happy your vacationers are, right? And so the end users are hopefully having a good go at it, and they're having a great time, and this may, in fact, mean you're ready to scale to the next phase. Most of these organizations are operating off of timelines where it's very rare that they're going to just jump right into the deep end and say, let's do everything all at once. So there are increments to these initiatives, and as the first increment goes well, hopefully, then you go to the second increment and the third and so forth, and you go down to that engine room. If you've got 100 guys shoveling coal into the powering mechanisms, then that's X amount of overhead. And if to go to that next phase, you've got to add more manpower to support it. I mean, this is what we're talking about with contractors. And is this thing designed such that it's a very clean engine room with just everything is running on some sort of electrical basis, or are guys truly down there shoveling coal? Mm-hmm. It can be a complicated data center that, as you scale, you constantly have to add manpower and have to add more servers, storage, et cetera, as you scale. That can really slow things down, and it can really cause problems in this phase as you jump from one successful phase to another. You're almost starting all over again if you have it engineered right from the get-go.
Mm-hmm. Gary, you've talked about developing a pilot plan and that scalability issue. You don't want to just be in the pilot phase forever. You eventually want to reap the benefits of this throughout your organization. Tell me about the steps that you intend to follow as you move from pilot to maybe a bigger pilot, but ultimately to an organization-wide and enterprise-wide deployment.
So when we sat down and laid out the design, we designed it from end to end. Mm-hmm. We designed it with the expectation that it would support the entire agency. Now we're slowly rolling that out, bringing the boxes on. As we expand that rollout, I mean, that's all phased in. So we're doing this in phases, but it was critical, and we sat down and spent a lot of time making sure that we designed it with the end goal in mind, and actually set things up in such a way that you brought in the extra boxes, the extra end pieces that you needed to plug in as you needed to expand that capability. But you didn't want to find yourself, I'm out of room. Okay, I've got a delay because I didn't factor this in. Now I got to re-engineer everything. So it was really critical, and we're hoping we've got it right. Mm-hmm. We've got some variances built in so that if we made a mistake, we left ourselves a little bit of room for not perfect. Mm-hmm. So we left that in, but I think it's critical that you sit down and say, what's your end goal? And our end goal was for the entire agency. So everything we bought, everything we designed was with that end goal in mind.
Chuck and Greg, Gary brings up a point that I think is really important. Now, nobody is expecting, given where we are budget-wise across government, to have a big explosion in end users. But capacity and capability is a different story. I mean, you all are doing things at your agency that 5 years ago, and especially 10 years ago, nobody would have ever dreamed that you were able to do. So tell me about building in flexibility, whatever you want to call it, as you're trying to plan for this, so that you're not back on your heels 5 years from now, as much as you can be, to be able to deploy. Chuck, we'll start with you on that one.
Sure. Well, it's certainly a balancing act. And I remember a friend of mine once said, thin client always equals fat pipe. So you've got to make sure that you've got plenty of network resiliency there, because you're only as good as how you deliver that experience to your customer. So it's a balancing act. I don't think we've have it patented as far as how best to do it, but just make sure you've got plenty of capacity to start with, and then options to add quickly to that you can afford as you need it, because the users are demanding more and more data. So the demands, are going to continue to skyrocket while budgets stay static.
Greg, that's the headroom is, I imagine, a tremendous issue for you.
Yeah, and I think just to really describe virtualization, we've talked mainly about desktops, but there's virtualizations of firewalls, virtualization of routers, virtualization of switches, virtualization of networks. So it gets back to the complexity issue of where you are and where you need to go. What we found very helpful is just really kind of putting that technology roadmap in place, having a supported products list that says, okay, we really want to champion these kind of technologies, and we want to kind of atrophy these kind of technologies, and then just having the due diligence to force that discussion. As you know, the Pentagon's kind of a coalition of the willing in the sense of all the different stakeholders, and you have to kind of have that. What's been great is the DoD CIOs put out some very clear guidance. The budget is driving very clear guidance, and so it's really that convergence of ideas and technology to accomplish that. So that trade-off is really important, but it takes, as we've all talked about, partnerships and communications, and really some trust that's earned in what you can accomplish. So that balance is something we're always looking at.
Dave, Greg talked about resiliency earlier, and this flexibility seems to me that it's a similar issue, building some headroom into your system so that you can anticipate, or so that you can deal with issues that you don't anticipate today at some point in the future.
Yeah, and there's, I think one of the things that all of us can do is look at the most modern data centers of today. Look at the largest IT presences in the world. Companies like Google or Twitter or Facebook, or who have just obviously massive data centers, but who can't speculate on where they're going to be a year from now and buy for that. Right? That's too costly. They can't cross their fingers and hope for the best and try to predict the future. They have to scale incrementally on a very small basis, and every single thing in their data center has to be just running at max horsepower in order for them to keep their costs low and be as efficient as possible, right? So they need to scale. They need to have obviously 5 nines uptime. I mean, that's their entire business model. They are, every single one of them, they've turned to commodity hardware. They no longer put these massive specific functionality components in that all have to work together in harmony. And like Greg is saying, this is an era where software is defining the data center. So if you can put commodity hardware in and say, okay, at one moment this piece of hardware is acting as a server, and in the next moment it's the SAN, and the next moment it's a switch. Then you're truly you're no longer letting hardware define your data center. It's software that's running on the hardware that's saying, I'm going to use this underlying horsepower to provide X. And that's where the simplicity comes in. These guys are using inexpensive hardware, and they're using it consistently. So they have one device to replace, one device to work on, one device to have expertise in, rather than tons of different devices, all of which require training and specific manpower.
Dave, final thought. Do you expect to see the trends that we've talked about and the concepts that we've talked about continue, or do you see a potential change in the trajectory here?
No, these trends are gaining momentum, and as I said earlier, things like data center consolidation, mobility, DR, COOP, all of this just points directly towards virtualization. And so virtualizing then is going to trigger this notion of, okay, how do I host it? What do I do with my data center in order to make sure it's successful? And that's going to say, people are going to turn to the biggest guys that have been doing it for a long time and say, hey, why don't we do it the same way in a much more modern fashion rather than what we've been doing for the last 10 years.
Dave, thank you very much for that. Thank you all, gentlemen, for your contributions. A terrific conversation. Greg Garcia of the Army, Gary Bartlett of the Postal Service Inspector General's Office, Chuck Riddle of the Government Printing Office, and Dave Gwynn of Nutanix. Thank you for joining us. I'm Francis Rose. This conversation's hosted by Nutanix, Eliminating the Pitfalls, Steps to Virtualization on Federal News Radio.